Bonsoir. Merci d'être venu ici à la 4e salle, to the 4th stage of the National Arts Center. My name is Paul Wells. I write for Maclean's Magazine. I'm here to announce a small programming change. In light of recent circumstances, we've decided that tonight Alexander Shelley, the music director of the NAC Orchestra, will interview Andrew Potter, the editor of the Ottawa Citizen, on the question, is print journalism really dead? Je veux vous remercier de venir ici en ce temps un peu orageux et vous avouer qu'il y a un prétexte à cet événement ce soir. We're here tonight to let people know, to let more people know who don't already know about an organization called the Southam Club, which is a going concern here at the NAC and with some of us young folks. The Southam Club is a social organization of young professionals, young leaders in business, politics, journalism, public service, staycations, whatever it is that they're up to these days. What we do is we do fun things around events at the National Arts Center. So we have, from time to time, met with members of the NAC English and French Theatre backstage before and sometimes immediately after their performances. We have gone to dance performances and met members of the dance groups that tour through Ottawa from time to time. It's thanks to the Southam Club that I know that Akram Khan, who will, the Bangladeshi dancer who's coming here this weekend, is a big deal, and that if I find it at all possible, I'm going to go and check him out, because the Southam Club makes you smarter, because it brings you to things. On fait parfois des événements en pleine cuisine, du café, au sous-sol, et c'est pas juste qu'on regarde les chefs cuisiniers, on devient chef cuisinier et on cuisine nous-mêmes les affaires qu'on fait manger le plus souvent par d'autres. Just to be on the safe side, and it's really a good it's a good thing. About a half dozen formal events a year and friendships that extend far beyond the actual Southam Club events. This is the sort of thing tonight that we will sometimes do. We get two people to sit together and discuss interesting things, and then before and after, to be on the safe side, we serve alcoholic beverages. So we will be giving you more information later about how to join the Southam Club, although I know from some familiar faces that many of you are already members. And after Alexander and Andrew finish talking, and their guest Nadia Sirota, the violist, who will be playing as a soloist with the orchestra this week, after they're done, I'll be back up here to give you even more reasons to be grateful for coming tonight. The surprises will just keep on coming. This whole thing was my idea. I know that Alexander Shelley, this small thing, not sort of Ottawa, but just, I know that on top of being a dynamite conductor and a handsome devil, Alexander Shelley is a fantastic advocate for music and its role in society and for art in general. And I know that because I've spoken to him so many times that I thought just this once I would not speak to him, because he's preaching to the choir when he tries to tell me that music is good. Andrew Potter needs convincing. Yes, also a handsome devil.
Yeah.
Andrew's the editor of the Ottawa Citizen for at least the next 36 hours, and will then, after that, be the next director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, at which time he will stand revealed as one of Canada's leading public intellectuals, although we hope to see a preview of that tonight. No pressure. Without further ado, here is Ottawa Citizen editor Andrew Potter, music director of the National Arts Center Orchestra, Alexander Shelley. Gentlemen, take it away.
Go ahead. Thank you, Paul. What do you want me? Yeah?
Hey, smells good. That's working.
Yes.
These nuts. It's crazy nuts. I wouldn't say you convincing. here's my problem, is that for me, I came to classical music through Bugs Bunny, like most people I know. And, but it's very appealing when it's set to a cartoon. And it has a certain, it's very intuitive when you see it, like what's opera doc, or any of those things. And it's interesting, we see the same thing with our son. We have a 2.5-year-old son who likes, he likes Beethoven, which he has come to through the Muppets. Me, 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 and he likes Beethoven's Ninth and Beethoven's Fifth, one of which he calls Better Beethoven. I'm not sure which one he is. But the problem I have...
You know that joke?
What's
How
that?
many symphonies did Beethoven write? Well, there's the Fifth, and then there's the Ninth, and then there's the... Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
But the problem I have as a consumer is that I come to classical music in the way I come to a lot of things I see in a museum or even in an art gallery, as someone who comes and looks at something and goes, oh, that's lovely, or boy, does that look old, right? But I don't know the context in which, so when I hear Beethoven's Ninth, they all kind of sound the same to me, right? It sounds great, I like it, but I couldn't tell you what one person did, one person didn't. So for me, the question so much isn't, is classical music dead? It's, what does it take for a musical tradition to be alive? Is it just a lot of people coming to it through Bugs Bunny or the Muppets, or is there something more to it? Like, what is it for it to
Well,
be alive?
first of all, good evening, everybody. Nice to see that you made it through the snow. I've been saying to friends, I feel incredibly butch walking the 3 minutes it takes to get to work here. I feel like Shackleton, it's much more manly than in London. Anyway, thank you for all coming. I hope you have a lovely evening. I think what is a great start in what you said for our conversation is that you're enjoying Beethoven's Ninth. Because one of the things that happens a lot in classical music, or music full stop, is that people will hear something, they don't like it very much. So you've heard something that you like. And I have to say that the first metaphor that always jumps to mind with this is something that I experienced in my teenage years. We have a lot of beautiful galleries in London, a lot of beautiful exhibitions, and I used to go to the Tate Modern when it was reopened, this wonderful building, this wonderful space, because it was kind of cool to go there. I had some friends who wanted to go and have a coffee and hang out, so we went and did that. And what I used to do is I'd walk around, 15 different rooms in about 10 minutes and just stop in front of something I liked for a few minutes and then move on, which is basically one way of looking at art, and it's one way of listening to classical music, is to sort of turn on a track or listening to any music. Could be jazz, could be pop, could be world music. You just play it, you say, no, don't like it, moving on. Next one, next one. And we live in an era which is, of course, designed exactly for that, whether it's information or whether it's art. We have the choice, I don't like this wiki entry, I'm going to move on to the next one. I'm going to find a more interesting article on Google about something. And where I had a revelation from the point of view of visual arts was when I went to the Tate with a friend of mine who was studying art history. And we went into the first room, and I was ready to get my skates on. I had my coffee in mind. I was looking forward to relaxing in the cafe looking out at the river and just sort of getting through the gallery as quickly as possible. And we stopped in front of the first image, and he started to talk about it. He started to contextualize it. He started to point out some details. And suddenly, I didn't want to look away. Suddenly, I started to think, oh, okay, well, that was the context in which the painter created this. I wonder why he did that. And then we started to talk about his personality, about his political motives, about his views. And my friend pointed out that the more one acquires knowledge about these different techniques and the different periods, the more insight one has into the work. Sometimes you can see just a canvas that's been painted black. And everyone talks about how unbelievably important it was in the history of art, and you think, well, I can do that at home. There's music that's like that. The famous 3 minutes and the silence, 3 minutes, Well, okay, great, anybody can do that. But it was a statement on certain developments that were happening within music. So anyway, that on the one hand. On the other hand, I think a very important, a very interesting conversation about music is, okay, it is a given, because it is a fact, that the more someone can take you by the hand and introduce you to this wondrous, extraordinary world that is music, and the phenomenal men and women who have created music within it. If you're lucky enough to find someone who can do that, you're going to have a great time anyway. But then there's the whole other relationship with music, which is simply somebody comes into a concert hall and they hear sound. And the equivalent of just looking at a painting. And should we expect that when you go to a classical concert, that you simply love everything? And the answer for me is no. And one of the working premises we've had around the office since I started was that it's not about like or dislike. And if you're going into the world of classical music, or frankly, any of the arts, and this includes a lot of great pop music as well, with the idea, okay, I'm either going to like this or I'm not going to like it, and it has to fit in one of those two pigeonholes, then it's not going to be a very fruitful or fulfilling experience, because you, through that, take away the largest repertory of expression that a composer has. Every composer that has existed has been able to express joy. And they've all been able to express, dissonance and something very dark. But all the nuances in between are very important, and that's where this conversation begins then, I think.
Right, but I want to press you on this point, because, you don't want someone coming and saying, I liked it, didn't like it, but at the same time, it would seem to me that you don't want someone just kind of going, wow, I really sort of bask in the joy of that composer. I mean, one of the interesting things about having Paul Wells as a friend is you go see a concert with him, he comes back and he says, what'd you think? I say, oh, that was great. And he goes, oh, it was terrible. Right? And you're like, well, why? It was, well, the horns were sloppy and the...
We're not talking about one of my concerts.
No.
Paranoia sets in immediately.
But I guess in the same way, it would be a travesty if what happened to La Scala was just simply the only people who went to La Scala were tourists who came and gave a standing ovation every time someone walked out on stage and yelled loudly and then kind of walked off, right? So how important is it to you to run the risk of getting booed?
I have absolutely no problem with boos whatsoever. You can't take... okay, let's put it differently. Nadia, who's going to be joining us in a moment, our wonderful soloist, and I, or any other musicians in the orchestra, could easily go to a concert and come out as professionals and have completely different opinions about how good or bad it was. That can easily happen, just as you can read an article by an esteemed colleague and think he's an idiot, and someone else will think he's an absolute genius. Right. This can happen. Just as those... but just as those great... philosophers and poets who've inspired composers over the years have also, take Nietzsche, who we're going to be talking later about Wagner, take Schopenhauer. These are people that they revered for a lot of their ideas and they disliked for other reasons. So it's important to, and frankly that's what music is about. It's about these frictions, because music is just another way of expressing who we are. Okay,
so one more question on classical music, then I want to talk about conducting your role. In your interview with Andrew Duffy of The Citizen that he did, I think, back before Christmas, you said that one of the what was valuable at classical music is that it's one of the few windows into the past we have. We can't talk to Napoleon, but we can listen to Beethoven at the same time as him and sort of experience that. Yeah. Is that what classical music does? Is it a window of the past, or is it more than that?
Oh no, it's more than that. But what I was referring to there is, I always find it quite a beautiful thing. You can't smell the streets of Paris. In 1812, 1814, 1850, you can't, with very few exceptions, really feel the textures of the time, because everything by now has been renovated. You can't speak to the people. You can't see the exact same sky from back then. There are so many things that we can't do from that period. But when you hear the sound of a Beethoven symphony, when you hear the sound of Mozart, when you hear the sound, for that matter, of, it could be Indian music, it could be Chinese music, but you're hearing a direct connection with the things that people then heard pretty much exactly as we're hearing it now. But that's the sort of museum piece element of it that you referred to earlier. It's a nice sort of fun thought. I think it'll come to no surprise to anyone that the reason that literature is important, the reason that poetry is important, the reason that great architecture is important, and anything that expresses what we would describe as an artistic sentiment, is because of the universal truth that's carried in it. And that's how you can also start to talk about good or bad art. And it's a long conversation to have, but one of the most fascinating things I find about music and art in general is that there is an extraordinary close correlation between perfection of form the intellectual, academic, scientific elements of how music is constructed, and for that matter, art, painting, and its beauty. And so I simply cannot subscribe to this idea that these are two worlds. And in fact, that is the greatest paradox that we all face when we talk about the arts, because we talk about it as a separate entity. And it was Einstein who said, you know, the arts and science are part of the same tree. And I see exactly what he means. That's why there are so many great mathematicians who love music.
Right. So let's talk about conducting. I mean, let me just ask a straight question, then I'll sort of get into something a little more fussy. What is your function? What do you do?
So, no, you can laugh, it's fine. I'm used to that. Well, what do you do? A little bit like talking about what music is, talking about what a conductor is kind of difficult because it's a lot of different things. And it depends who you're standing in front of and what the group does. If next week, and in fact, day after tomorrow, I'm going on a tour of Atlantic Canada to meet some young orchestras and some young choirs and to work with them a little bit and just, you know, meet the communities there. Now, when I go there, my role as a conductor will to beat very clearly so that I act as a living metronome, somebody who doesn't make a clicky sound, but where you can see where the beat is. So if 30, 40 young kids are just trying to sing a text that they're having difficulty remembering, they're trying to sing it together, they can see a beat from me. And to make physical gestures whereby they feel confident singing the song in the right way, in inverted commas. Now, that's the function of a conductor as a timekeeper. And of course, there are far more complex iterations of that if we do The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. Even though that's repertory for most symphony orchestras nowadays, if the conductor isn't clear, there's a lot of things that will break down there because the rhythms are so complex. And that's one example of many hundreds of pieces where the conductor is simply there to make sure that the orchestra has a point of reference for the beat. But above and beyond that, there are many, many, many different subtleties about what a conductor does. So it begins with the beat. If you as a room have to say the word, let's say you've got to say shh. And if I go like this, you'll probably go shh. Yeah. But if I go, you'll probably say it quite loud. So those are the two obvious extremes of what a conductor does. Right. Now if I go shh like that, you'll probably attack it like that. If I go, so that is part of my timekeeping function. Let's say I'm giving you the entry when to go shh or shh or shh. But I've broken the mic. But that will, so when a conductor is doing their job well, that was very relaxing, thank you. You can carry on doing it. Massage as well as... Exactly. So when a conductor, from the physical point of view, is doing their job well, then he or she will, in one moment, impart the essential rhythms, the impulses an orchestra needs. And in the same moment, they'll be imparting the attack, the articulation, so how we say sh or sh, or, you know. And then they'll be imparting also, as that note is played, where that note is leading to. So if you've ever seen me in a concert and I'm sort of flailing around with my left hand, what I'm normally doing is indicating to the orchestra where a phrase is going to and away from. Now that may sound like a fairly obscure thing, maybe you understand what I mean, but in every sentence we do the same thing. I'd like to drive the car. I'd like to drive the car. I'd like to drive the car. There are three different meanings. Right. And music is the same thing. Ba 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 ba, or ba 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 ba. It's a subtle difference, but as I'm going to maybe talk about in a minute, if you say the entire symphony, and I'm giving away what I'm about to talk about, but if you say the entire symphony is based on those four notes, and you decide as a conductor, and this is then when we're getting into the other part of my job, that the emphasis is on the first note, ba 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 bum, that has an effect on the entire piece because the whole piece is based out of those four notes. So everybody has to go ba 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 beep ba 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 beep 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 beep. But if I say ba 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 ba, then the whole piece becomes ba 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 beep. And there we have the beginning of what interpretation is a word I also dislike. We can talk about that in a minute. Right. But so there's the physical side of what a conductor does, but the physical side has to be at the service of the intellectual side and emotional side of what a conductor does. So I spend many, many hundreds of hours a year sitting at a table, studying the scores. And this is normally when also people say, what the hell are you doing studying the scores? What does that mean? And what I do is I try to understand the syntax of the music. So just as with the example of the sentence I gave you, I'd like to drive the car, I'd like to drive the car, I'd like to drive the car, as banal as that is, I don't know why I'm using that. But I try to understand within the context of the greater work what function each sentence has, what the intention of the composer was, what role it plays. So if you like, it's the role of a director reading through a play and thinking about the different functions of the roles, thinking about how these texts interact, with the difference being that I then lead the text in real time in concert. Now, through that, you stop me at any point, I can witter on like this for hours, I'm sorry. With the, and what tends to happen, and it's an interesting part of my life, you very quickly, I mean, I say quickly, it takes 50 hours of the beginning of studying a piece, you can start to establish this is great music, or this is good music, or this is maybe not so good music. And perhaps in a moment I'll talk about why Beethoven's Fifth, which is something I've all heard, I'm sure, it's such a great symphony. And you may be wondering, why is it such a great symphony? It's because of the efficiency of the way he uses his material. Now, one of the things that's beautiful about music and about classical music and music with bigger forms, there is some pop music that does this. There's some albums that definitely have a sense of arc and were conceived in that way. But every symphony, every sonata is like a creature. And it's created of its own DNA. The reason that the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven is so famous, may I?
Yeah.
Very quickly.
No,
okay, so what
please.
You've got this.
Let's keep talking.
But in fact, the second two notes are related to the first, yeah? So we have ba 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 beam, ba 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 ba, yeah? And then the rest of the piece, ba la dee da, it just keeps on going like that. And it's this minor third, or major third here, and then a minor third here. And what he does is he builds the entire first movement out of that phrase. So we have dee la dee da da da, and then, yeah, and it goes on and so forth. And then we reach a cadence, ba ba bum bum bee, and then he restates ba 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 bum, again this little interval, and then he says, right, what happens if we go down, dee da, dee da, dee da, and he keeps going down in this minor third. And that's basically what he does for the first, in this piano reduction, the first 4 pages. And he does that throughout the whole first movement. And then he creates the second movement out of this theme. If you go... Yeah, and he basically creates this whole first tune out of that. So da da dee da 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 dee da dee da dee la da dee dee da 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 da. Yeah. It just goes on and on like this. Yeah, every single interval relates to the first interval of the piece, and then the next tune in the second movement, he goes. You probably hear. Yeah, and then ba 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 beep ba 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 ba. It's thirds all the way through. That's the whole second movement is built out of that. He starts the third movement. Whoopsie daisy. Oh no, don't do that. Okay, he starts the third movement. So, and then he inverts. Just trust me, he does. He inverts this thing. And then the theme that comes straight after that is. Which is, of course, it's the same figure, yeah? So he does that all the way through the third movement. And then in the fourth movement, and he plays that again, we don't have enough time for that. Then what he does is. The theme of the fourth movement is also based around these thirds, major third and minor third. And then he brings that all the way through the movement. So the interesting thing about that symphony is that instead of having 4 movements and within each movement having lots of different themes, he took 2 notes and 1 rhythm, and he created the entire symphony out of it. Now, it's what I mean by it being like an animal. You know, scientists spend hundreds of years trying to work out DNA codes, and then they reduce everything down to a very small string that we're all made out of. And each symphony has this. Each great musical work has this at its core, this efficiency of use of language. And of course, it's not just a gimmick or a trick. What it does is it plays with expectations in our mind, and they're subconscious, of course. They're subconscious when we first hear the music, but it's my job as a conductor to analyze them and to understand them so that they can then be hidden again. But when we're thinking about interpretation, I have to have in the forefront of my mind how it's been constructed.
So let's talk a bit about interpretation then, before we get back into some more music, about your sort of theory or philosophy of interpretation. Because in the news right now, there's actually a big debate going on in the States right now. A Supreme Court Justice died, Antonin Scalia, who is known as sort of the chief proponent of a theory of constitutional interpretation they call originalism, right? His idea was, it's not my job to interpret the text in light of contemporary mores or anything like that. I just need to figure out what the people who wrote the Constitution intended. Period.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's this Canadian tradition of the Constitution's a living tree. You got to interpret it, blah blah. Is there something like that in conducting? Is there something like that debate? And
well,
where do you?
First, I have to say that anybody who engages with any piece of music or piece of art has the right to do with it whatever they want. It's their experience. The way that I approach interpretation, why I dislike the word, is that I don't actually try to interpret, I try to understand. And it's exactly the same thing. There's a lovely quote that I use for interpretation. Picasso used it for creative artists. I'm not a creative artist, I'm an interpretative artist. I just said I didn't like that word. Whatever. He said an artist spends their life trying to draw a perfect circle, and the deviations from the circle define their artistry. This is exactly how I view preparing a piece of music. I don't think, what is Alexander's take on this? I think, what was he trying to express, or she trying to express? What is the core of this piece from the point of view of craftsmanship, but also the emotional content? And then I try to be true to that. By virtue of the fact that I'm not Brahms or anybody else who's been interpreting, there will be those deviations from the circle, but that's not my intent.
Right. So when I was cramming for this last night, I was reading an article that was written in the New Yorker a few years ago, and it quoted Robert Spano.
Yeah.
Saying this was his kicker. He said, I think of composers as setting up possibilities, not creating objects. There's no such thing as Beethoven's Seventh. It's merely a hypothesis. Does that make sense to you?
I mean, the words make sense, yeah.
Yeah, but that doesn't, you don't go, yeah, that's right, or...
I mean, I understand what he's saying.
The words are in English. Right?
Yeah. No, I mean it's
okay.
A book by Tolstoy. You could say, well, that's just his story.
Exist, right?
You know, it's still there.
Yeah.
But you know.
Okay. So last question about conducting. I'm going to read you something else. This is from Keith Richards' autobiography, and. I'd be interested in knowing if this is his take on rock and roll, on what you're trying to do in rock. And I wonder if this fits what you think you're trying to do as a conductor of an orchestra. He says, what you're looking for is a situation where the sounds just melt into one another, and you've got a beat behind it, and the rest of it just has to squirm and roll its way through. If you have it all separated, it's insipid. And so what you're looking for is power and force without volume, an inner power. And he says, you want to bring together what everyone in that room is doing and make one sound. So it's two guitars, piano, bass, and drums, but it's one thing, not five. So the art of rock and roll is to create one thing.
I agree with the sentiment wholeheartedly. I consider myself, and I think pretty much any musician does the same thing, I consider myself unbelievably fortunate to be able to do what I do. Not just because of the side that I was discussing before, the studying of music, which it would be lovely to talk at length about, because it is a world when one dives headlong into it. Each one of these pieces, any piece you take, and the same applies to pop music, and to all music. Once you delve into it, in fact, I might that's just very rich, just as an individual to be doing that. But what I get to do when I'm in front of an orchestra and with an audience is something that is, in fact, unique. So we have anything between 30 and 120 people on stage. And when things are working well, it is a true symbiosis. It's a true moment of oneness. And that applies not only to me and the orchestra and to the orchestra members with one another, but between orchestra and audience. That moment where it's a if you like, a form of meditation. It's hyper awareness, but with no awareness of the world as we think of it in an everyday life, which is why so many, this is why people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and a lot of great thinkers have always been fascinated by what it is that happens in music. Because, again, this is, whether one subscribes to the idea of the sort of noumenal world or anything like that, the idea of forms, ideas, things that are sort of perfect iterations of the things that we see in life. They felt that music was a connection to that. That moment where a huge group of people come together, and it is a religious act. That's why concert halls have something of a cathedral to them. But that shared moment, and it can be a rock concert, it can be Nico Muhly's piece, it could be a Brahms Requiem, is one of the highest forms of human experience. It is unbelievable. And to be able to do that as a profession is something very special. And we didn't really talk about this question of whether classical music is really dead. It's the really I love in that. As if the autopsy's been done, everyone's sure, but really, yeah. I get to go to a different city in the world every week and stand in front of 2,500 people and experience that sense of collective mystery and going to a place that you don't go in daily life. You just simply don't.
Okay.
And if just to pick up what Paul said about print media.
Between philosophy and media.
I think we all know what the experience is like also to be, so to speak, in the hands of a really great writer in a piece of print media. It's not the same experience, but it's also when you have someone who has real depth of analysis. That is also something that is priceless, but unfortunately people don't want to pay anything for anymore.
So let's, I'll throw one more question at you, then maybe we can get to some more music. Speaking of print media, one of the problems we're having is that we have an audience that is getting older and is quite set in its ways, sees newspapers as a certain habit, and like the way things were for a very long time. And over the past 4, 5, 6 years, we've tried very desperately to transition to a new audience, a younger audience, a different kind, digital, and so on. And that's been very difficult because you just run the risk of alienating your base while you try and bring in a new base. And so you end up not entirely succeeding at either. You alienate the old and the new ones don't come along. I suspect there's a similar, I wouldn't call it struggle, but a similar effort going on with classical music.
It's interesting when I'm at any given orchestra in the world and people say, our average subscriber age is 62, or it's written on it's in this terrible situation. I said, well, what was the average subscriber age 20 years ago? If it was 62, you don't have the same problem. If it's always 62, then you're looking at something else. You're saying, well, as an institution, would we prefer to appeal to a younger demographic, or are we comfortable with this thing? If it's, of course, if 10 years ago it's 52, then in 10 years it's not going to look great.
Right.
But that's one thing, and I mean, Nadia can speak to this as well in a moment, but I see wildly different demographics around the world. So in Ottawa and Nuremberg, where I have orchestras, I see on average a slightly higher demographic, or older demographic. If I'm working in the capital, let's say Berlin in the UK, London in the UK, Berlin in the UK, Berlin in Germany, London in the UK. Go to the Far East, South America. I see on average younger audiences, but sometimes even within a city it'll vary from night to night. So there'll be certain weeknights. It's interesting. We have our concerts on a Wednesday and Thursday. But growing up in London and then in Düsseldorf where I studied, we did a series. I had an orchestra over there. We did a series. Okay, that's a car. I thought it was my mic. We did a series that's in a hall with my then chamber orchestra, and we basically very similar to what Nadia does, and she'll mention this in a moment. We basically worked with artists from a whole load of different genres, did a concert every few weeks. Sometimes it was DJ, sometimes it was hip-hop artists, sometimes it was pop artists, jazz, and we built a program using new music with them and juxtaposed their music with ours. Started the concert at 9, finished it whenever we were ready, like 11, 11:30. Concert length doesn't matter if people are into it, like films. And then we had a party afterwards. And then we saw within Düsseldorf, for example, that there is that demographic there. So I'm hugely optimistic about classical music, whatever that is. We should have defined that at the beginning. It's 400 or 500 years worth of music. It's very different to put a finger on. It's like saying, is literature dead?
Right.
I mean, you can say it, but anyway, I'm hugely optimistic about it, but I think that there are certain barriers to different generations. I think that there's at least the generation that I grew up in, we have such an access and such an easy access to information that I actually believe this idea of getting behind what's going on is incredibly attractive, rather than no questions asked, you should like classical music, but rather saying, hey, this is a whole vibrant and exciting world to get into.
So just to push that a bit further, when you and we had lunch about a year and a half ago, I think, and I wish we'd taped that whole lunch, because we just played that and sort of sat back and watched, because it was wonderful. But one of the things that you talked about then was that you'd done something where you stood on like a big tower in a big field like Nebworth or something like that, and divided the crowd into like quadrants and made them. You want to talk about that? It seems like a stunt, but
yeah, I'm music director of the Nuremberg Symphony Orchestra. And the city decided about 10 or so years ago that they wanted to redefine this space, turn it into something positive. So our orchestra is in one of the buildings, which is a nice use of the space. Then there's one of the best museums you'll find about the rise of the Nazi Party in another part of the building. And then we took this space called the Luitpoldhain, where you will have seen, without realizing it, pictures of Hitler standing in front of 300,000 soldiers talking. It's that space we use every summer for what is now the largest classical open-air concert in Europe. And for the last, I guess, 8 years, I've conducted the orchestra there in front of 80,000 people. And we do, an hour of music, then half an hour break. The sun goes down, we do another hour of music, then we do about half an hour of encores. And I moderated and I talked to them. And after one of the... during one of these encore sessions, I jokingly got them to sing along with one of the pieces. It was Mambo, Bernstein Mambo. And then I said, sort of offhand, we'll do a canon next year and see how you do with that. And then a few months later, I'm in rehearsals and I see on my schedule, meeting Ray Cannon. And I was like, what's this, the canon? And they said, well, you said we're going to do a canon next year, so we're doing a canon. And I said, okay, well, why are we having a meeting? And then they explained to me that if you have 80,000 people, it's not that simple to just... You have to work out where the canon, because it's recorded, it's on like the radio and television, you have to work out where the canon's going to be recorded from and how you're going to do it. So anyway, God, this has taken a long time. I'm sorry. What we did was in the middle of this huge field with 80,000 people, they built a 9-10-meter high tower. And what I did was I started the orchestra off on some Oompa Oompa march. I ran backstage, ran down the left, right, through up the sort of emergency exit sort of divider between the audiences. And they started putting their hands, and I was running up like this, like a rock, and then I get to the tower, and I climb up it, and then I get to the top, the orchestra finishes their thing, and I'm like, and then I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split you up into A, B, C, D, and then I said, like, you're A, you're B, you're C, D. And then we did Frère Jacques, but of course in German, Bruder Jakob, it's a Bruder Jakob, Bruder, yeah, blah. And what they did, they gave, it's one of the great moments of my life, actually, thanks to they gave me, those things for landing planes, So I'm standing there with these 80,000 people, and I'm like, you, and it was great fun, and so that's what I did. And then we did the next year, and we wanted, it would have been Guinness Book of Records' largest canon ever, but the Guinness Book of Records, because it's not ticketed, it's a free concert.
Right.
They said it either has to be ticketed, which it wasn't, or we have to measure the size of the crowd in 100 units. They'd have to go into a little pen like pigs and then out the other sside. So we decided not to do that. But the next year we did the biggest square dance. We took a silly piece of encore music, and then I taught them a dance, and then we all did that. So yeah, why are we talking about
the
this?
reason I brought this up was because we were talking about engaging new audiences and so on, right? Yeah. A while ago, and it just occurred to me that there is a piece of property in the city called the Breton Flats that they're trying to figure out what to do with.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe...
Well, if you've got $250,000 up your sleeve, then happily.
Okay. Why don't you play some music?
McGill?
Yeah.
I don't know, they're rich, aren't
Yeah,
they?
that's right. McGill. They were swimming in. We keep talking, but maybe you want to get to some music? Do you want to...
Well, just listen, what I wanted to point out, because people often ask what classical music is, and talk about pop music in a sort of as if it's something completely different. I was thinking about that last night when I was thinking about today's conversation, and I wanted to talk about two things. Firstly, most pop music is related in a lot of ways back to gospel, and gospel is related to church music of the 17th, 18th century from Central Europe. Now, I'll give you an example. If you know this tune, do you know that tune? Okay, so that's a traditional melody from the 18th century. And then if you take, you can hear how they're basically the same chords, yeah? Gospel, written 1963 or so, it's by Billy Taylor. Then you take a couple of years later, you know the song, yeah? I see skies are blue, what a wonderful world. Same chords, you hear that? Yeah? Whoops. And then you can take from that, for example, you know Sunny? Yeah, the song? Sunny. Okay, basically exactly the same chords. Now, that means you've got 300 years of history. You'd say, oh, one is pop, one is gospel, the other one is traditional classical. They're the same. The DNA of the music is actually the same. The chords are virtually identical. There's a couple of added notes here and there. And the interesting thing also is when we talk about classical music versus pop, the same principles are at play. So if we take the song that I was playing, which is called I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free by Billy Taylor, we've got a home bass, which is F major, and he goes home bass, and then he moves to the relative minor, which will make you feel a little bit melancholy. Yeah? And then what he does is he moves through the home bass to the second most closely related key. Home bass, B flat major, which is the second most related key, and then to the most related key, C major, back to home bass. So that's the first phrase. Let's say it's called the A. And it feels kind of like, oh, I got a bit sad, then I feel comfortable again. Yeah? You feel that, yeah? And then what he does, is he does a little B section where he moves from F major, home, to the closest related home, okay, which is C major. So we've got up to now A bit, then B bit, and then so we're now arrived in the close key, and then he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to play the first bit again. Okay, so we've got A, B, A. And then he says, I'm going to stick a little tail on it. Let's call it C. Okay, so we got A, B, A, C. And this is a pop song, basically. It's a gospel song, but all pop songs work on the same principle. Now, what you have there in mini is what all first movements of symphonies are based on, which is called exposition, which is called sonata form. Okay, and the broad shape is you have an A section, and then you have the B section, which is called the development, and then you have the A section, which is the turn of the bit you heard at the beginning, and then you have a little coda at the end, the C section. Now, within that, what the composers do is they'll have, instead of one tune, they'll have two tunes, and what they'll do is they'll do a little mini development between them. But that has developed over the years. So if you listen to home, nearest to home, back home, second from home, home, nearest to home, it's exactly the same. It's Mozart, yeah? It was written 250 years before. Exactly the same principle. So when people say there's pop music and there's classical music, in fact, that is not true. The way that they're constructed, the DNA and the music behind it is identical. But the history of classical music, and this is where the Wagner comes in, is full of a thing, ultimately, which sounds kind of kinky, called cadence delay, which is, rather than allowing it to happen quickly, you have to wait. Now, Beethoven wrote his symphony in sonata form, the first movement, and there are some alterations in the. Can you hear me? Yeah, there are some changes, but basically it's in sonata form. Then there's this whole other genre of classical music, if we're talking about symphonic music, which is telling stories without that kind of form. Sometimes it's opera, sometimes it's what's called tone poems. But one of the most perfect operas ever written was by Wagner. It's called Tristan and Isolde. And I know that you may, along with Beethoven's Fifth, have heard of how important Tristan is and why it's so interesting. Now, if I take the opening chords of this, as a contrast to what I just talked about, with the Mozart and this cadencing the whole time and finding resolution, which makes us feel good. There's no doubt about that. It's what we all love about pop music, is that you're taken away from home, but you're taken straight back. It's comfortable, and quite often you have a beat which makes you feel even more comfortable. You're like, oh, thank God, I know where I am, I know what's happening. But if you take the beginning of Tristan and Isolde and try and work out where you are, yeah? Do you know where you are at the moment? No. Because nothing's resolved. There's been no moment where you could say, I am in a certain key. That hasn't happened. That hasn't happened. Now, to spare you having to listen to me play the piano, the entire opera goes on like that. That you think, my God, that's beautiful, but when's it going to finish? And he does this very deliberately, because I mentioned I mentioned Schopenhauer before. At the time that he wrote this, he was obsessed by what Schopenhauer was saying. And it doesn't have to be about Schopenhauer. It could be about anything. Romeo and Juliet is basically the same story as Tristan and Isolde, very very roughly. Tristan is a knight who's been sent by his king Marker to go and pick up Isolde, who's an Irish princess, bring her back to Cornwall so Marker can marry him. Her. It's pretty much that simple. But Tristan, in a previous story that is related, killed Isolde's ex-fiancée, which she was pretty upset about, and he was injured, and his name was Tantris at the time, which is a very clever reordering of the letters. And instead of killing Tantris, because Tantris looked her in the eye and she basically fell in love with him and decided she wouldn't kill him. She let him go on the condition that he never comes back. But anyway, then Tristan did come back. He takes Isolde. She's furious, absolutely furious about this. They go on the boat together, and she orders him to come to her, and she says, we have to drink to the past and to put it behind us. And of course she's planning to poison him. And what she does, she gives him this drink, she drinks from it, but something's gone wrong and they both end up falling in love with each other through this drink. And so that's the first act. And the second act, what they do is they spend the whole time trying to meet one another and trying to spend time together. Now this is where the Schopenhauer influence comes in, because all the stuff that happens during the day basically gets in their way. It stops them being together. And that's an allusion to the phenomenal world, the world that we all inhabit, according to Schopenhauer. And what a lot of artists found fascinating was this idea of the noumenal world, this world of ultimate truths, which can't be accessed when you're alive. And Schopenhauer argued that that's what music, as the only art form, can connect to, that moment where you have no understanding in play, but you feel deeply. That's a connection with the noumenal world. It's rather fantastical, but it's a beautiful and rather romantic thought. And you can see why people like Wagner and Strauss loved it. And I'm passing incredibly badly some very complex and very beautiful ideas. But in the second act, that's what happens. There's this interplay between night and day. At night, Tristan and Isolde are able to spend time together. And there's transcendental moments. There's almost a resolution. I won't play it. There's almost a resolution to this. And it literally is, like a climax in the sense that you're probably all thinking of, really is in the scene. That's about it. And then someone bursts in and everyone's like, oh God, it's already been 3 hours and we thought it was about... Okay, and then you have to wait another hour. But what happens then is that we have this famous Liebestod, love, death, just like in Romeo and Juliet. King Marker finds out that Tristan and Isolde fall in love with each other, even though Isolde is supposed to be his woman. He's furious. Tristan's best mate ends up mortally wounding him. Tristan gets sent back to his home to die, and is told when he gets back there by a sort of soothsayer type that only Isolde coming will allow him to live, and that they're going to fly a flag when her boat is seen or play some music. And anyway, this doesn't happen. He sort of deteriorates, and then finally she comes, and just as she arrives, he dies. And she's, heartbroken. And just as she's lying over him and starts to sing, King Marker is arriving with all his men to apologize to Tristan because he's found out about this potion. It's all very, very tragic. And I'm being trite about it. I'm sorry. It's not. It really is incredibly sad. And then she sings this Liebestod, which is 9 minutes of perhaps the most beautiful music ever conceived. And what he does, Wagner, is he takes these initial unresolved chords, and what he does is he goes. Sorry. I'm not going to be able to play it well, sorry. But anyway, you'll hear it on the recording. We're about to, yeah, that's better, cue up a recording for it. And what she decides in this, within this philosophy of saying, only in another life can we really fully experience, she decides of free will to give up her life. And through the course of this, I will read you very quickly the text. If anybody is still interested, I brought it with me. She sings a very beautiful text over the body of her lover, and then gives up her soul of free will just as everyone else arrives. And she sings in this excerpt, softly and gently, see him smiling, how the eyes that open fondly. See it, friend, don't you see ever lighter how he's shining, borne on high amongst the stars? Don't you see how his heart so bravely swells, full and calm it throbs in his breast, as from lips so joyfully mild, sweet the breath that softly stirs? Friends, look, don't you feel and see it? It is only I that hear this way, so wondrous and gentle, blah, 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 blah. And then she says, in the billowy surge and the gush of sound, in the world's spirits, infinite all, to drown now, sinking, unconscious, void of all thought, highest bliss. And that's basically, in a nutshell, Schopenhauer's theory, and Wagner spun it out to 4 hours. Yeah. Do we want to hear a bit?
Do you want to play it, or do you want to get... we're running just a bit short of time.
Oh, well, then let's
do you want to maybe get Nadia involved?
I
or
think
do
that
you
would be nice.
Maybe skip the...
let's skip
Nadia?
the music.
Skip the music. Who cares? Let's more talk.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So...
Hi.
Hey, Nadia.
Hi.
How's it going?
Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
This is our wonderful soloist, Nadia Sirota, who'll be performing tomorrow night from New York.
Hi.
If you want water.
So do you want to start? Do you want to start by just introducing the piece, play it, and then talk about it?
Sure.
Is that or
Yeah,
do you
or
want
maybe there's a couple things
Yeah.
I've been wanting to talk about. Number one, the difference between pop music and classical music, which as you've pointed out really beautifully, formally is not there. But there is one difference which is interesting and actually kind of relates to that Bob Spano quote of yours, which is, what is the text? And for classical music, the text is a score, and I do think that's sort of what Bob Spano was talking about when he's talking about, Beethoven's 7 is just a theory. If you think about music as just a vibration of space, right, and that's what you perceive as music. Music is sound. There is a translation that has to happen between score to sound that you hear, and that's your job, and that's my job, and it's a fascinating job. And what's weird about pop music is that, at least for the past, 50 years or so, we've thought about the text of pop music is the record. Mm-hmm. So Grateful Dead, the text is that recording. And you go to a concert, I don't know if you've been to, any pop concerts, but basically the situation is every time they play the hits, everyone's happy, and then they say, this is something from the new album, and everyone goes,
Yeah.
Right, because what they want to experience is that record which they've experienced by themselves at home. And it's a fascinating thing. And I think this is sort of one of the lovely privileges that we have as classical musicians, is to take something from text and transmute that into vibrating air and vibrating space.
And again, there's, and that's absolutely true.
That's really interesting.
There's a lot of differentiation there, though, because the modern iteration of a score is very different to 200 years ago. And improvisation in classical music was a huge part of the classical music world. Playing something once and never hearing it again is still a classical piece. There was no relationship with a printed text there. And indeed, there are a lot of aleatoric works where it's still the case, where you improvise large sections like we're doing actually in short moments in this. But this question of listening to something, and exactly the same in pop music, you like hearing something something that's new, it's kind of a bit weird sometimes. That's because when we talk about listening, we mean so many different things. There's what I like to call the passive listening, which is to say something which I already have a preconception of is now going to wash over me, and I'm going to enjoy its effect. If something is strange in it, that I'll catch. If it's an interpretation I'm not used to, then I'm going to feel uncomfortable again. And then there's the active listening, which is a little bit what I described earlier. It's saying, okay, if you have these 3 notes, and this is why, just again to take a slight aside, this is why sonata form, the thing I described earlier, exists. Because in music, in classical music, what happens is that A bit that I described gets repeated. And then it gets developed, and then it gets repeated again. Now that's not coincidence. What a composer wants to happen, and this is where I mean active listening, is he would like to state ba-ba-ba-bam, and he'd like you to remember that. Whatever it means to you, he'd like you to know this is the material that I'm going to work with. Ba-ba-ba-bam, and I'm going to do that with it. Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-bee. But then he repeats that whole section again, so it's really nailed into your head. And then if you're actively listening, you can start to pick out these moments of themes. Now, it doesn't mean it's a better listening experience or worse, but it's a different one, and that's what's happening.
So yeah, and this goes also back to where you were originating this conversation, which is thinking about going to an art gallery. The great thing about visual art is you can experience it on your own time frame. That is one of the incredible flaws and incredible beauties of music, which is that you are subject to it however the composer wanted you to, and you're basically held captive for a period of time, which you can't adjust unless you listen to a recording of it. You can't go back and figure out what was going on. Mm-hmm. So all of these sort of brilliant thematic and compositional moves that composers are using, from my perspective, they're so that you can figure out what's going on. There is an additional player in this entire thing, which is not true for visual art, which is that of an interpreter, which, as we've talked about, is a complicated word, very problematic word. But when you read a book, you are both the performer and the audience, right? When you look at a painting, you're both the performer and the audience, or maybe the painter's the performer. It's a complicated situation. When you're hearing a piece of music, somebody needs to get that thing from the piece of paper vibrating the air so it can get to your ears. And I feel like our jobs as interpreters and our jobs as performers are to figure out what the heck is going on in that score, and then try to present that as legibly as possible. And
the assumption there, though, because in terms of a book, it's absolutely true. In terms of a play, it's of course very different. But in terms of visual art, it's not quite as simple as that, because the way a work is lit, the distance from which you're allowed to view it, the context in which it's hung, are all decisions made by a curator. They also say, what does this work mean? Do we need to hang it individually on a wall, or can we clutter it up with other stuff that will then complement it? So actually you're seeing, when you go to an art gallery, a form of interpretation as well.
And that was sort of my initial response to you, which is I feel like curation, if you can go to an art gallery where things are just, you're like, this is a very famous art gallery, it's got a lot of old works in it, and then you can go and sort of look at them and have them wash over you, and that can be your experience. Or you can go say, okay, I'm going to go see an exhibit on conceptual art, I'm going to see Dan Flavin, what's going on, and then somebody has maybe written something really beautiful and concise at the top of the exhibit that gets you in there.
Absolutely.
But to sort of go back to why am I in this room and what am I doing here, I've had a long collaborative and just friendship relationship with the composer of the piece we're premiering tomorrow, Nico Muhly, since we were in school together, in college together. And what's really fascinating about that is, I mean, a billion things, because he's a terribly interesting person and all of that stuff, but figuring out who he is and what he's up to in his music is something that I've had about a decade to do, which is actually way more experience than I've had with literally any other composer, including Bach, which I've played every day for my entire life, you know. So I can really be like, what is going on here? And as somebody who has an inside route to all of that particular thinking, I am trying then in my performance to play things as legibly as possible, to communicate to the audience what I'm experiencing through this piece and how I'm sort of making my way through the map of the piece in a way that should, on first hearing, be comprehensible, at least to a certain extent. And it's a fascinating and weird job.
You said something interesting about your relationship with Nico that I read about, and about, I think it was about this piece, that over the course of your relationship, he's learned when he's writing, composing for you, he's learned what he can leave out.
Yep. Yeah.
Can you expand on that a bit? I thought it was kind of a very interesting remark.
So, looking at scores, we basically, like, the joke is that a fly poos on the page and we analyze it, right? And so, and it's very, very important to be like, what does this dot mean versus this dot versus this dash? Or at least it's a great question to have, and it, like, yields wonderful conversations, and we can sort of figure, I agree with you that I think basically anything in music can work if you make it work. But it's wonderful to sort of figure out what all of these things mean. I think with regards to Nico's writing for me, we have a shorthand, so he'll mark the strings in the orchestra quite specifically in terms of articulation and length and where the phrase is going. And for me, he'll leave a lot of that out because we've been working together for a while. And to a certain extent, my artistic impulses have evolved along with his music, such that his impulses are similar to mine on some level, and he trusts me a little bit. So there are ways in which I'm making my way from note A to note B to note C to note D in that way where you're talking about, sort of forming a sentence. And he leaves a little bit of that up to me because he knows what kind of thing I might do, and if it's not exactly what he wants, that's cool with him, which is an interesting form of trust, I think.
And so to what extent are those works playable by other...
They're definitely playable by other
Right.
people. I have 3 seasons of exclusivity, so they can't play them for a couple of years. But no, and that's actually one of the great joys of being somebody who commissions new work, is seeing a piece go from something that just exists as sort of an intimate connection between you and the composer and the audience, and then becomes repertoire, as we say. And that's an incredibly joyful experience.
Yeah.
So do you want to play it?
Sure. Yeah, we'll play a little bit of the second movement of the viola concerto.
You good to go?
Bravo.
So this is making its debut here tomorrow?
Sorry, no.
It's debuting tomorrow?
The Canadian premiere
Canadian
tomorrow.
premiere So why is it important to bring works like this to the NAC?
Oh, well, it's I think one of the fundamental things that we should be doing in this city is making sure that great new creative artists have a forum. And Nico Muhly is one of the great young composers. I've loved his work for the last 10 years. I like his writing as well. He's just a very thoughtful, very interesting guy. And he's part of a long and very rich heritage of American composers. You hear in his work influences of a whole lot of different people, among others Christopher Rouse, whose work we're doing a month later, who was one of his teachers. But John Adams, there's a link, as you would have with a writer or a painter, that is really tangible. And it's interesting just listening to those few phrases, because we were inside the music this afternoon performing it. It's nice sometimes to just listen from the outside in a different way. But one of the things that we all have when we listen is, of course, a large vocabulary of reference that is subconscious. And a lot of it with new music actually comes through film. So, famously Stanley Kubrick's films use anything. Most of the great 20th century composers come up in Stanley Kubrick's films. Just when you're seeing somebody being slashed to bits, or when you're seeing some terrible snowscape, you hear one of the great core works of the classical repertory. And there are a lot of figures like that just came in the viola. Can we say what it means? No, it's not like, okay, this motif has meaning X. But that kind of dropping, slightly melancholic motif is connected through 500 years back to how it was used in medieval times. It is part of our anthropological development. These things are in there, just like cadences. This going back to home base. there's very interesting and compelling articles written about this, not just by musicologists, but also by experts in artificial intelligence and language, about tirom, that amen, the resolution is in there in our subconscious somewhere, this relationship to the word amen, and some other liturgical texts. So when we listen to those high-lying flute lines as well, and some of those dissonances, it is speaking to us through distant times, just like when we see somebody and want to run. What am I talking about now? Anyway, my point is, though, that I often hear people saying, I don't know anything about classical music and I don't really know how to listen. And there's two things to say to that. First, you know a hell of a lot more about it than you think you do, just from or rather you've experienced much more of it than you think you do, just from being alive, because it's everywhere. Secondly, everybody has incredible ears, and I'll tell you how. You can pick up the phone to your mum, and you know whether she's in a good mood. Well, firstly, you know it's her, rather than any other random person on earth. You can tell when somebody says, hello, okay, that's my mother, she's in a bad mood, she hasn't eaten for 3 days. You know, that's how sensitive our ears are. We can tell with every nuance of when people speak to us. Without seeing them, we can see what's happening. That's because we have incredibly sensitive ears to sound. And if you can do that with a speaking person, then our capabilities, collective capabilities, to listen into music, to delve deep into that soundscape, just in those 50 seconds that we heard of Nico Muhly. There's so much going on there that I'd love to listen to it again like 5, 6, 7 times. We'll get to in the next couple of days. It's nice, but it's very rich music.
And here's another thing about that. When you talk about, our experience with music and our experience with classical music, I've said this before and I'll say it again because I really do believe it. I think that new music, I think contemporary music, is easier to get into than classical music because it has a vernacular similarity. There is something 2016 about this piece, or 2015 about this piece, right? Because it was written in the same world in 2015 that we've all lived through with all of its weird influences and all of its barrage of media and everything. There's something about this piece that you, as a citizen of 2016, can grasp onto. And I think it's easier to get into classical music via what's happening right now than it is to say, okay, you want to get into classical music? Let's talk about Bach.
I agree, absolutely.
Because you know what? Bach is actually, it's amazing, but there's no cultural vernacular, like just one-to-one analog there. So starting from where we are now and moving backwards, I feel like is a really, really lovely way to get into classical music.
I agree. And that's the other reason. I mean, not only is part of what we should be doing as a National Arts Centre, but my belief is for our audience here, not just sort of our role as a national entity, but our audience here, that it is the most wonderful way to maybe get into a world that you're not aware of. Is to, the personalities are alive now in New York. He's living there. He's working with a lot of great classical musicians, of rock musicians, everything, right. and his music is 2015. And this is another interesting conversation around all music, whether it's pop or classical, but. I quite often will cite someone like Shostakovich, whose music I'm sure you all know. One of his, Eyes Wide Shut, the film, his jazz waltz came up famously in that. I think Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise are about to, do it or something. Anyway, that comes up there, and it's a beautiful tune. Everybody knows it. You can hum along with it. And Shostakovich was incredibly gifted at doing that. He could write theme after theme after theme after theme that you could remember and just hum as you walk the street. But he decided very rarely to actually do that. And the question is why? And there you get into also an interesting question about what it is that composers do and what classical music does. He wasn't particularly interested in writing nice tunes, even though he could. He was interested in expressing his state of mind within the time in which he lived. Now, in 10 days I'm conducting the Fifth Symphony of Shostakovich, and I don't find the symphony formally or technically difficult, but I'm always absolutely stressed in the weeks before I do it, because I have to find a way, as a privileged guy who grew up in London, who had lovely friends and education, never had to really suffer, I have to find a way to put myself in the shoes of this man who was a huge genius, who lived an incredibly difficult life, and to try and then interpret the symphony, or rather conduct the symphony. There we are. And that is easier, let's say, both as an audience member, as a performer, when it's music of our time, because you don't necessarily need to put yourself in those shoes. You're there in the moment. And it is a very, very good starting point. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So I think they want us to open up to the audience. We're running sort of time, but we did start a bit late. But I have sort of one last question that I wanted to put out to both of you. When it comes to something like this concerto, and I guess everything you're doing in general, in journalism, we sort of have figured out now how we know whether we've succeeded or failed, what we're trying to do, because we have analytics, right? We have these real-time boards in the newsroom that tell us, what's doing really well on the website right now. And if you don't have access to that, you've got, Paul Wells has 50,000 Twitter followers, and you write something, and there's, a whole bunch of people going, Wells, still an idiot, or Wells, in the tank for the Liberals, or whoever. And so there's these sort of like real-time metrics we get, and we know.
He's not listening. He's tweeting.
Yeah, he's tweeting. He's like, he's like at the bottom. Of course he is. Sorry. How do you, apart from just the ebb and flow, or hopefully the ebb of audiences, or sort of the flow, whatever, whichever one comes in, over time, what counts as success and failure? Like, how do you know?
Yeah.
Like at the end of tomorrow night, did we fail? Did we succeed?
So I think this goes back to this concept of curation, and I think that it's complicated when you're talking about reaching an audience, because it's a very personal thing. I think that I'm going to be the most successful at the thing that I'm most psyched about personally. And let's just take that as a given. If I am completely obsessed with something and can somehow communicate that to an entire room full of people, get them to understand a little bit about what makes me so keen on something, and do that in real time. It's like what you're talking about with the, it is a rite, it is a ritual. We're taking, thousands of people at a time, hopefully, and getting them to feel something at the same time. Might not be the exact same thing, but it is something in time. And it's incredibly powerful. If I can communicate the thing that I feel about this in a way that is legible to a lot of people, that's a success for me. And there's no way, I think that's going to be the most attractive thing I could possibly do professionally. I can't say that this person's going to like it or that person's going to like it or tons of people are going to come or whatever, but I think that's the way that I'm going to be the most successful advocate. It's really, really dumb, but my dad's a composer and my mom's an Episcopal priest. And I'm just an evangelist for new music. Like, that's the thing that I have put together of my two sides of my family. So it's not, for me, it's just about trying to communicate as successfully as possible what I like.
Yeah. Right. That's great. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more with all of that. There's a lot of very, very smart, very hardworking people in this building who spend their days trying to answer that question. And I think we know what to do if we wanted to put together a season where we basically get full houses all the time. There's a list of works around the world. It's famous. If you say let's do a Shostakovich symphony, you can say, well, we could do 5 or 9. We could maybe do 8 at a stretch, or 7, and we will have fairly good houses. It won't be full, you know that. But if you start going down the route of 11, 12, 6. No one will turn up. It's just like that. You have that discussion everywhere around the world. It's the same with Beethoven symphonies. You can say, well, if we do the 5th, it's a full house. If you do the 9th, it's a full house. If you do the 6th, 7th, pretty good. 8th, like 1 and 2, pretty much forget about it. 3 is good. 4, dodgy again. It's just a fact. So if all we needed to do here was to fill the building, we would know what to do. But that's not what we're here for. And frankly, if you program like that, you shrink the audience long term. Right. Because people then are listening in a completely different way. They're not actually exploring this world. And you expect the same of great exhibitions. You expect the same of any great institution, that they're saying, we understand what our audience loves, and we're going to take that as the core of what we do. But we believe, and we believe strongly in this and this and this, not as an alternative, but as an addition, as something that complements. And my job and the job of our wonderful team here is to have that back and forth. We put together programs, and we speak to our marketing department. Our marketing department has very realistic, very pragmatic feedback that they give us, and so we know what we're getting into when we do certain things. But it's important that we don't just live according to how we get a full house.
My working principle is always leave them wanting more. So we're going to end the formal part of the festivities tonight, but I believe, if I know Andrew and Alexander, they're probably predisposed to stick around for a while. And Nadia, I don't know if we have Campari, but we can probably find something. Finally, would you do me a favor? If you were interested in what you heard here tonight, would you get out and tell people that we have a new music director in town named Alexander Shelley, and they should come and check him out? Say it on Facebook, say it on Twitter, buttonhole your neighbors as you're shoveling out the driveway, as you must certainly do. And if you also want to say that music is alive, and it comes and it talks, and it's charming and articulate, and its name is Nadia Sirota, and she's playing this week, you can say that too.
Yeah, it's true.
And the next time someone tries to run down the Ottawa Citizen, tell them that Andrew Potter is a real person who's fun and interesting and asks good questions.
Yeah, that's true.
And he's leaving, but thank you very much. Merci. Bonne soirée.
Thank you.